It is Tuesday, the 21st of January, 2020. This is David Gauci. Dave Nagel and I welcome you to the 13th talk in the Business and Energy series of Forum 2100. Today, we're delighted to have Gregory Nemet as our guest. Greg is on the faculty of the Robert M. LaFollette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There, he teaches and conducts research on topics relating to energy and resources. Among his many accomplishments, Greg recently has been designated as one of the lead authors of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. Today, Greg is addressing an audience that spans 11 time zones. His topic is the topic of his recently published book, How Solar Energy Became Cheap, a model for low carbon innovation. Anyone who's interested in how to respond to challenges presented by climate change should be encouraged to take a look at this book. At least one of the compelling reasons is that the thesis of the book is so hopeful. Greg has already begun his talk and has made three really key introductory points. And let me summarize them here. The first is that for solar, for photovoltaics, no single country persisted in developing and commercializing the technology. Every lead country relinquished its lead in turn. No top producer company ever remained the lead for more than a few years. Each country made a distinct contribution, and this occurred in sequence. First, it was the United States that led, followed by Japan, followed by Germany, then Australia, and ultimately China. So that's point number one. Point number two, international flows of knowledge were crucial in this process. People know how materials, machines, finance, policy ideas, and final products all were highly and globally mobile. So that's point two. And point three, PV, Greg argues, provides a model for other analogous technologies. But as Greg argues, cheap PV happened entirely too slowly to be relevant for nascent technologies. He argues that innovation needs to speed up, likely by as much as a factor of 4, in order for new technologies to scale sufficiently and to be relevant to the energy system and to climate. Let's join Greg now as he is addressing his audience.
It's really happened slowly, and it's happened way too slowly in order to apply it to other technologies that we may need. And so I want to finish with a couple of points about how we might accelerate innovation. So that's really what I want to get to. No one country, international flows of knowledge are crucial, but we need to do things faster for other technologies. I'll just start going into these slides with just a couple of minutes on context. And this is one of the most basic points that I make in my classes, which is that doing something on energy is hard, and it's hard for 3 reasons. So first, that we want energy that's cheap, that's clean and reliable. I don't think anyone would disagree about that, but people and countries and companies disagree very strongly about which to prioritize. And that is partly what makes energy hard, is that those are often trade-offs, and it's elusive to find technologies and solutions that accomplish all 3. The second issue is, if we look historically, we've had really slow transitions from one energy carrier to another. So 60 to 70 years to go from a bio-based economy in the 1800s to a coal-based economy after the Industrial Revolution, and then to where oil becomes the dominant energy carrier in the 20th century. So those are slow changes, 60 to 70 years to go from one to another. And then finally, if we think about climate change, if we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere, that's really different from environmental problems we dealt with in the past, like particulates or sulfur or NOx emissions, where those get rained out of the atmosphere within a few weeks and CO2 doesn't get rained out. It stays for 100 years. And so all of these three aspects, these trade-offs that are hard to remedy, these slow transitions, and then the CO2 problem itself, all make energy transitions slow, and it makes dealing with this problem really hard. And so I found that I was making those points quite well and discouraging people as a result of it. And so one thing I've tried to do is ask myself why I continue to work on that. And one thing I've written up recently is putting together some reasons why I'm actually optimistic about dealing with these problems despite the challenges on the last slide. And the first one, and that's the one I'll talk about today, is really about technology. And technology, even while politicians are dithering and have been for 30 years about what to do about energy and climate change, in the background, technology is improving, getting more efficient, getting more effective, and costs going down. And that's really what I'll talk about today. And that's my biggest reason for optimism, because it supports these other reasons as well. So let me just first make this point that solar is now very cheap. These are data in terms of dollars per megawatt hour, and a megawatt hour is the average electricity consumption in a US household. So I think for people in the US, that's a pretty good approximation for a monthly electricity bill, and that dashed line is the average, about $120 there. But you can see how solar's come down in cost over time. The red dot to the right are where experts thought solar would be, and they're almost all wrong. And if we look at some of the lowest power purchase agreements signed in 2018, those are lower than the most optimistic prediction by the most optimistic expert for 2030. So we're way ahead of where even the most knowledgeable people on solar PV thought we'd be. So this is motivation for trying to understand not just what happens when we have solar PV that's less than $20 per megawatt hour, but what is it that led to this sharp trajectory of cost reductions? Because we've seen it in PV, but it's also happens in other technologies too. We've seen it in wind as well, and we're seeing it in batteries in a very similar way to PV, and we're probably only halfway along the story of where PV has got to with batteries. So putting these three together leads to a lot of interesting possibilities. And so the question I try to think about is, could we align these types of curves to other technologies that we need? So first, let's just understand that left-hand curve. How did PV get so cheap? So that's what I spent the effort to write a book about, and it was really based on collecting data over the last 15 years and trying to doing econometric models on cost reductions in solar, but thinking that maybe there were issues and factors that were getting left out of those models because they were hard to measure, hard to incorporate in models. And so the idea here was to see what was in people's heads. And so what I did was interviewed 75 people in 18 countries who'd worked on this problem over time and understand what factors they thought were important and try to put together the story in addition to the data and the models that had been producing insights over time as well. So I guess if I had to put the whole book result in one picture, this would be it. So the first takeaway is the change that we've seen. So 4 orders of magnitude from the first solar commercial application, which was a satellite in 1958, to these $20 per megawatt hour contracts that I talked about that have been signed in the last couple of years. So a factor of 10,000 cost reduction. As you can see from this slide, there's not one single breakthrough. There's not one big drop in cost. It was a steady progression, an accumulation of events that happened over time. And as you can see by these icons here, different countries contributed. Basic science, so Einstein won the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect for his 1905 paper describing it, and Bell Labs scientists used that understanding to develop the first efficient, 5% efficient PV cell in 1954. And that led to the first commercial application, which was the US Navy buying solar cells to compete with Sputnik in the late 1950s. And then from then on, we've had just a set of accumulation of cost reductions and performance improvements. Let me focus, since I'm short for time here, let me focus on 3 of them though. The first one is what happened in the 1970s, and that was the Arab oil embargo in 1973, and then later the Iranian Revolution in 1979. A huge influx of money to deal with energy, especially in R&D, especially on creating liquid fuels from coal and gas, and commercializing, enhancing nuclear power. But a little bit got spent on solar, and because solar budgets have been so small, it made a huge difference for solar. So about $1 billion in R&D goes into solar in the 1970s, and it entrains a lot of expertise from other sectors of the economy. And I think one of the most important sources of external knowledge that gets applied to solar PV comes from the microelectronics industry. And so Paul Maycock was hired in 1974 to lead the solar part of this response to the Arab oil embargo, which was called Project Independence. And he said, you know, in calculators in the 60s, we figured out that the more we made, the cost would go down. And it was a way to combine the marketing department with the engineering department and create shared expectations about what would happen as we sell more units. And so Maycock looked at the historical data, about 15 years at that point, starting with that first 1958 satellite, saw the cost reductions, and then said, well, in calculators, we get about a 20% learning rate. So when you double production, you get a 20% cost reduction. And maybe it could be slower than that. So let's see what it looks like at 10%, and maybe it could be faster at 30%. And these are all Maycock's data from 1975. And the only one I've added is that 2018 point, just to show that, you know, we've been pretty much right on his projection from 1975 about where costs would be based on how much we've actually produced. And so this idea of a learning curve and of costs going down becomes helpful descriptively, but it also leads to some policy implications. The first one was that the US government started a public procurement program in the 1970s to get the costs down, and later other countries started doing subsidy programs. And again, the idea with subsidy programs there is not just to deploy a lot of solar and create employment and offset pollution, it's to get the technology to improve. And this idea of the learning curve really underpins why we would have subsidy programs. It's so that we don't need to subsidize it anymore once the costs come down. So that was the US role, especially in the 1970s, R&D, public procurement, and the creation of the learning curve. The other two, and as you can see from this picture again, the other two important players in this latter part were Germany with its renewable energy law and China. So let me just spend 1 minute on each of those. With Germany, what happened there was a policy window. In the late 1990s, the Green Party comes to power with the Social Democratic Party. They adopt policies from Japan and from the US, so guaranteed contracts for purchasing electricity from the US and a rooftop program from Japan, and create the world's first feed-in tariff, 20-year price guarantee at high rates for anyone that can produce electricity from solar. That creates this large market and new demand. And the demand, again, it's not just to create lots of solar, but it's to stimulate, in this case, investment, because it created expectations that there'd be a demand in the future. It led to lots of investment, not just in solar panels and solar power plants, but in machines and equipment that were used to produce solar. And so here's a wire saw here. And you started, because the market was so big, you could actually have equipment suppliers that were not just repurposing equipment from the semiconductor industry, but developing machines that worked for solar. And that became known as Germany's gift to the world, was this demand and then the cost reductions that accrued to it. But it wasn't only Germany that played a role here, it was also China responding to the German market. And it's really kind of two phases here. In the 2000s, it was this extremely Wild West entrepreneurial activity where $5 million, a company gets started. Within 5 years, it goes public on the New York Stock Exchange. And that creates this really interesting international dynamic where it's a Chinese company, goes public. So it's US pension funds, retirees that are funding this Chinese solar company. That company is buying equipment from Germany, from Switzerland, and from the US to produce panels in China. And then they're selling those panels to Germany and later to Spain, to California, Italy, and other markets as well. And a lot of the intellectual property behind that, or the expertise behind that, comes from training that happened at the University of New South Wales and a small company in Australia. So it's really this international system of knowledge moving around the world. So it's really kind of bottom-up, scrappy, entrepreneurial in the 2000s. After the global financial crisis hits, there's lots of state support. So there's tens of billions of dollars of low-cost loans that go in. The Chinese create their own market in 2011, and by 2013, they're not just the biggest producer of solar panels, they're the biggest purchaser of solar panels. Two aspects of this period that are really important: competition. So none of the Chinese companies even though they're gigantic, they're never more than 10% of the world market. Earlier in times when Japan was leading, it had 30% of the world market with Sharp. And then when the US was leading, its leading companies had 30% too. But the Chinese companies were always much more competitive with each other and never got as big as the Chinese and American companies did. And then automation is a huge part of the story. And now we're talking about cheap electricity and potentially half of electricity, within the next 20 years from solar. And so that's China's gift to the world. One thing I think, just to illustrate where we are with solar in China, this is what a solar factory looks like in China. And you can see how many people are in that factory right there. There's a few people reflected in the glass that are gawking at the machines doing their thing, but it's almost entirely about automation at this point. So just to summarize how solar got cheap, it's really a sequence of 3 areas: of creating a technology, then of building a market, and then making it cheap. US really led on the first category of creating a technology. Japan and Germany were really crucial in building that market. And then China played the most important role in making it cheap. So it was a sequence of events, and then you can see the different factors within there. Let me just, since I've got about 3 minutes left, let me just talk about what this could mean for other technologies. And one thing I start to say is that the PV model doesn't work for all technologies. So some models are kind of lower technology and they're small scale and have lots and lots of adopters, like maybe soil carbon sequestration. In contrast, there are other technologies that are extremely large and where the big challenge is not iteration and improvement, it's about system integration from the very beginning. And so large carbon capture plants might look like category number 3. And then finally, having general purpose technologies that have been crucial in the past, whether it's electricity or the internet or microprocessors, can be extremely helpful as well, and those need other models. But for the technologies that fit the solar PV model, there's the technology component, there's lots of units, and there's the potential to compromise on attributes that consumers don't care about in order to get costs down, which comes under this idea of disruptive technology. Direct air capture looks like that. So let me just give you an example of what we could do. So if we said it took, here's the time frame for solar PV from the first satellite to where we are now to this, say, 50% of electricity by 2040. Climeworks, direct air capture company, had its first commercial application to produce CO2 for a greenhouse in 2017. So they don't like this slide where it said, well, if you use the PV model, it'll be cheap by 2076 and have lots of adoption by 2099. That's way too late. So this is some work from integrated assessment models of climate change. It shows that for really relying on negative emissions technologies, they really have to start growing rapidly in the 2030s and be removing gigatons of billions of tons a year, maybe something like 5 to 10 by mid-century. And so we need to speed up innovation using this kind of simple model here by something like a factor of 4, so that we have cheap direct air capture by 2030 and then widespread adoption by mid-century. So it just all has to happen faster. And that's really kind of where I'll stop. Yeah, maybe I'll just skip over this one. This is just to compare solar to scaling up to 1% to see, we're in the same ballpark here. But this is my last slide, and this is where I'll leave it. And this is the work that I'm working on now, and where the book kind of ends up is kind of how could we go faster? How could we do that factor 4 acceleration? And the first thing I think about is that there's certainly not one lever to push, and there's 3 areas that I would focus on. So on technology push, so creating new technology, on demand pull, on creating markets, and then on knowledge flow. So that what's really happened and worked with solar PV is this flows of knowledge, getting it out of people's heads into data sets, into reports, so that things can be codified and used in other areas, knowledge spillovers from person to another, country to another, and this global mobility that I talked about before. So I'll stop there. That's my 18 minutes, and happy to answer questions or hear comments as they come up. Thanks.
Greg, thank you very much. You get a gold star for hitting it right on 18 minutes. So yeah. Thank you. We do have some questions. The first one is in your 3 reasons for why change is hard, you seem to leave out the economic factor for existing infrastructure. So the question is, isn't the power of large companies, for example, big oil, and small companies like gas station owners, distributors, suppliers, also a significant factor in causing the slow shift, particularly when this is tied to political influence.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess I would say two things to that. So it's a good point. Where I would capture that in those three reasons was these slow transitions. So that it took 60 years for this previous transitions to happen. A big reason why those are slow is that infrastructure is really long-lived in energy. So, you know, I'm 2 miles away from a power plant that was built in 1919, and we're still running it. And there's lots of infrastructure like that in terms of pipelines, transmission lines, power plants, and other things. And so that's what makes transitions slow, because, you know, if you've developed that asset over 50 or 100 years, and all you have to do is maintain it and maybe put some fuel into it, there's a lot of reasons to keep it going. So I think that kind of fits one part of the question. That's one reason why change is slow, is because stuff lasts a long time. And there's a lot of incentives to continue to use stuff that's paid off and can be run cheaply. And then the second response is in the bottom right of this last slide I'm showing here. One of the ways to accelerate innovation is to somehow acknowledge in a realistic way that there are economic actors that don't benefit from the adoption of the new technology, but maybe powerful enough to affect political decisions. And so finding ways to remove those barriers, and there's lots of different ways that you could do it. The Germans did it with their solar subsidy in a way. They were very realistic about who might block that subsidy, and as a result of addressing those, they made a subsidy that was much stronger and could last long. Because that's one of the biggest points on that bottom row on demand pull, is we need credible expectations that this demand will be sustained in the future if we're going to lead investment that has to do with training and new equipment and all the things that have been helpful with solar PV.
So another question, maybe sort of following from that, solar as an energy source is not a dense source of energy. And so if, when a solar project is installed, it's likely to last, what, 20 years, let's say? Mm-hmm. So are there limits in the way that you frame this to the ability to upscale in this particular case?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about spatial density, if there's a limit to that, you know, it's, we're limited by how much sunlight hits the earth, or if we're talking about a certain country, about how bright it is there. But, you know, in contrast to a lot of other technologies that do also take space, it doesn't need to be fertile space. You don't need to have water. You don't need to have soil. And as a result, you don't have to be displacing agriculture and affecting food prices. And that's a big issue for a lot of other technologies. And so I think that's one of the biggest assets of solar, is that, you know, it takes space, but, you know, it's not anything compared to the space we might need for, you know, for agriculture or for biofuels or things like that. You know, the amount of space we'd need for solar in the US to fuel electricity in the US 100% is on par with the amount that we use for golf courses in the US, which is, I guess we have a lot of golf courses, but it's not a gigantic amount. It's nothing compared to what we use for agriculture.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. As far as the relay race is concerned, where is the cutting edge innovation heading towards? Is the race going to be defined by costs and China will continue to lead, or do you think the PV model will cross-fertilize with other technologies where other countries are going to be leading?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, one thing is that I've focused on the cost of the modules, but as the modules have gotten cheaper, they've become a smaller and smaller part of the overall cost of solar. And in the US, most of the cost now, like 70% of it, is in the installation and all the non-module costs. In Europe, it's a little bit less. It's more like maybe 50%. So, you know, there's a lot of improvement that can happen on these, what's sometimes called soft costs. Those are often, you know, local efforts. It's rare that you could have an international effort that would reduce soft costs, and also local applications. So how do you use those cheap solar panels that may be produced in China, that maybe in the future could be produced locally, or that kind of thing? What can you do with them? Can you start to do energy intensive manufacturing in sunny places, because all of a sudden you have access to $15 per megawatt hour electricity. Could you run that those solar cells through a heat pump and make heat from it and start to do industrial processes with it? So I think a lot of the exciting innovation is how do we take advantage of this cheap, clean energy resource that we have, and there's a lot of potential to do that in lots of different places.
Okay, so here's another one. The Mother Nature seems not to respect any political frontiers. And climate change is really a universal issue and the problems associated with it. So what about the geopolitical impact of what's going on in the Middle East right now? It's remarkable what you've described in terms of cross-fertilization across political frontiers, but are there things that we may need to be aware of that come directly out of the political dynamic of the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe I just, yeah, that's a big question. So I don't know if I have a comprehensive response to it, but a couple of things come to mind. One is that a big difference between, say, concerns about energy security in the past is that if oil gets cut off like it did in 1973 and 1979, or just gets really expensive as it did in 2008, that leads to a lot of disruption, macroeconomic shocks, recessions, and things like that. And because solar is different, so if China decided to stop selling US solar panels as part of a trade war or something like that, all the existing solar we'd have would continue to run. The sun continues to shine. It's just a matter of, maybe shifting production to other places or starting to do it ourselves. And so there isn't this immediate disruption with solar that happens with, say, natural gas has happened in Europe, or with oil in lots of different countries. So that's one big difference. And then the other thing is, I have to say, in my 75 interviews that I did for the book, the most far-sighted people that I talked to were in the Middle East, were ones who were, in these oil-intensive economies, and where there's really a balance of deciding about the future between wanting to diversify and those saying, we've gotten where we are by doing what we can with oil. But the ones in those places that thought about how they could most take advantage of low-cost solar were by far the ones that kind of saw farther, saw the opportunities, push forward what happens with these continued cost reductions if solar keeps getting cheaper, if storage keeps getting cheaper, if we can start to change our industrial base by taking advantage of those. So I thought that was pretty interesting about where some of that innovation might happen.
So final question, how will cheap intermittent energy technologies, including solar, affect the distribution of electricity? Do you see improvements in the grid or distributed sourcing, or both?
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of change. It's good. It's a combination of things. So, complementary technologies. So solar plus wind works better than just solar. Transmission that can, hedge across places that, might have a thunderstorm or a windy time to move power where it's needed and where it's being produced. That's a big part of it as well. Demand that responds to expensive energy and cheap energy in a way that it doesn't as much today. Electric vehicles that provide a really helpful way to accommodate some of the changes in output through the storage capability that they have, dedicated storage for these, and then especially regulatory changes that change the way that entities that produce electricity and distribute it are compensated. Because in the US, that's really from the 1930s that we have the regulation where most electricity works today. And things are changing. We've got different technologies, and so to take advantage of those opportunities, the best thing would be to change the regulation so that those who are incurring costs to create social goods are getting compensated for that.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. This is a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure there are more questions that will be coming along. But thanks for joining us today in this interesting discussion. For those of you who may be interested in continuing dialogue with Greg, please visit the Forum 2100 website for Greg's contact information, which we will be posting with a link to the recording. Please mark your calendars for our next session, which is Tuesday, the 16th of February, the same time. Andrew Weber and Dan Feldman with a startup, Search for power. This is a startup that addresses the methane emissions problem that's associated with fracking. And they do this by introducing mining for Bitcoin. It's very creative. So please pass the word, find us on YouTube. And until the next time, Dave Nagel and I wish you all well. Bye for now.